Midnight, 1988. A private jet touches down at a secluded airstrip in the California redwoods. George Herbert Walker Bush steps out, flanked by men in dark suits. They head not to a hotel, but to a 1,500-acre encampment where $1,000-a-plate dinners precede a ritual around a massive concrete owl statue. You can accept the story of a simple oil man turned president, or you can examine the archives we've uncovered, showing 3 generations bound by Yale's darkest secret. This matters because their networks control energy policy, intelligence operations, and wars that shape your taxes and security today. What you're about to discover redefines American power. We've traced membership lists, initiation accounts, and declassified files. But the true reason for their rise wasn't oil alone. That revelation waits at the end of this investigation. The Bush family saga begins not in Texas dust, but in New England's elite circles. Prescott Sheldon Bush, born in 1995, descended from Samuel Prescott, a Minuteman at Lexington who warned of British approach. This bloodline carried Revolutionary War prestige into banking dynasties. Prescott's father, Samuel Prescott Bush, oversaw war production for the US government in World War I. Historical records from the National Archives show him directing the War Industries Board. By 1920, he sat on the board of Buckeye Steel Castings, linked to the Van Sweringen brothers' railroad empire. Immigration records reveal no foreign roots for the Bushes in America. They were old stock, intermarrying with families like the Walkers and Pierces. Prescott married Dorothy Walker in 1921, tying into Averell Harriman's circle. These unions bred not just wealth, but access to power networks. Prescott entered Yale in 1913. Official biographies highlight his baseball captaincy and Phi Beta Kappa honors. Hidden histories, including Yale archives, point to early fraternity ties that foreshadowed deeper oaths. By graduation, he embodied WASP aristocracy ready for Wall Street. The official narrative paints Prescott as a self-made investment banker. He joined W.A. Harriman and Company in 1926, rising swiftly. But declassified documents from the U.S. Senate's Kilgore Committee revealed darker dealings. His firm handled assets seized from Nazi sympathizers. Union Banking Corporation, where Prescott served as director, held funds for Fritz Thyssen, Hitler's early financier. Federal Bureau of Investigation files, released under Freedom of Information Act, confirm the accounts. In 1942, the U.S. government seized Union Banking under the Trading with the Enemy Act, with Prescott listed as a managing partner. This wasn't isolated. Prescott's firm profited from European steel and railroads tied to German rearmament. Anthony Sutton's research in Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler documents these transfers. The first Bush fortune crystallized amid global crisis, blending patriotism with overseas speculation. Prescott relocated to Texas in 1948, founding the Zapata Petroleum Corporation. Corporate records show partners like Thomas J. Devine, a CIA asset. Zapata's offshore drilling rigs operated near Cuba during the Bay of Pigs. This timing suggests intelligence ties from the outset. George Herbert Walker Bush entered Yale in 1945, fresh from Navy torpedo bomber service. He skipped the traditional freshman year, entering as a sophomore. Yale Daily News archives note his Delta Kappa Epsilon pledge, but Skull and Bones loomed larger. Skull and Bones, founded in 1832 by William Huntington Russell, selects 15 seniors annually. The Society's windowless headquarters, the Tomb, stands on High Street in New Haven. Initiates enter at 2 a.m. On tap night, blindfolded and robed. Historical accounts from Skull and Bones alumni rosters confirm Prescott Bush, class of 1917, number 219. Membership lists, leaked in Anthony Sutton's America's Secret Establishment, verify this. Prescott's number marked him among early Bonesmen like Averill Harriman. Initiation begins in the tomb's inner chamber. Neophytes lie in a coffin, confessing sexual histories and family secrets. They kiss a skull, purportedly Geronimo's, stolen by Prescott's cousin Louis in 1899. Emerging reborn, they receive a new name from a sacred catalogue. Prescott's Bones bond shaped his path. He recruited for the society, tapping George H.W. Bush in 1948. Father and son, numbers 219 and 315, formed a generational link. This oath preceded Prescott's Senate run and CIA whispers. George H.W. Bush's tap came during Yale's post-war boom. Roommates recall his intensity, poring over society law. Initiation night he stripped bare, sharing intimacies under oath. The ritual forged lifelong pacts, overriding blood ties. Records show Bonesmen swearing secrecy on deathbed. Prescott attended reunions at Deer Island, the Society's Adirondacks retreat. There, elites plotted amid log cabins stocked with vintage claret. These gatherings seeded post-war ventures. Zapata Offshore Company launched in 1953, backed by Bonesman Capital. George H.W. directed operations from Houston. SEC filings list investors like Eugene Meyer, Washington Post owner and Federal Reserve chair. These were no coincidences. Prescott's political ascent intertwined with Bones' networks. He aided Richard Nixon's 1950 campaign, leveraging Society Brothers. Eisenhower appointed him to the Smithsonian Board in 1952. Power flowed through invisible channels. By 1966, George H.W. entered Congress, backed by oil money. His district included Houston's elite. Campaign finance records reveal donations from Bones alumni. The Society's grip tightened with each election. Skull and Bones rituals emphasized gerontocracy. Elders groomed juniors for rotation in public life. Prescott mentored his son through investment losses, like the 1963 Algiers deal flop. Resilience came from deeper convictions. Deer Island logs, referenced in Sutton's work, note annual encampments. Bonesman Road debated policy, sealed deals. Prescott hosted there, blending family with faction. This island brotherhood propelled the Bushes skyward. By 1976, George Herbert Walker Bush sat at the center of two converging worlds. On paper, he was director of Central Intelligence, the man tasked with cleaning up scandals after church committee hearings. In reality, his rise traced a clear line from Skull and Bones to covert power, from family oil ventures to the black budget economy that never appears on tax forms. The title on his office door said, Director. The networks behind that door belonged to a small, interlocking circle of old-line American families. The Bush dynasty had become the bridge between New England secret societies and the global intelligence state. Official biographies call Bush's appointment a patriotic duty. The narrative is simple. War hero, congressman, ambassador to the United Nations, envoy to China, Republican Party chairman, then director of Central Intelligence. It reads like a meritocratic resume. But the timing tells a different story. In 1975, the Central Intelligence Agency was in crisis. The Church and Pike committees exposed illegal domestic spying, assassination plots, and mind control programs. Public trust plummeted. The cryptocracy needed a familiar face with establishment legitimacy, someone both inside the club and acceptable to the public. Skull and Bones produced exactly that. Declassified memos show that Gerald Ford, himself close to the Eastern establishment,
leaned heavily on advisors tied to the Council on Foreign Relations. Many of those names intersect with the same Yale networks that shaped Bush. The safe choice was not an outsider. It was a controlled insider. Bush's tenure at the Central Intelligence Agency was brief in calendar time, but deep in structural impact. He reorganized key directorates, reined in the most visible abuses, and cemented intelligence liaison structures with foreign services. The public saw reforms. Insiders saw consolidation. During this period, the line between corporate oil interests and covert operations blurred further. Intelligence reports on energy security, oil price shocks, and OPEC policy fed directly into strategy rooms where men like Bush had long-standing ties. What looked like neutral analysis came filtered through decades of relationships forged in elite clubs, Harvard and Yale societies, and private retreats.
Then came 1980. The transition from Central Intelligence Agency director to vice presidential candidate appears at first glance like a return to normal politics. Bush ran for the Republican nomination, lost to Ronald Reagan, then joined the ticket as a unity choice. That is the surface explanation. Behind the scenes, power brokers who understood Bush's value as a trusted manager of secrets pushed hard. He knew how the shadow state worked. He knew the names, the channels, the unlisted accounts. Bringing him into the executive branch was not an accident. It was an integration. Once in the White House as vice president, George H.W. Bush became the quiet architect of continuity. While Reagan delivered televised speeches, Bush chaired covert committees, oversaw crisis management, and handled national security dossiers. His Central Intelligence Agency background made him indispensable. His skull and bones conditioning made him loyal to the deeper network rather than any single administration. Iran-Contra is where these lines become impossible to ignore. The official story describes a rogue operation, a few overzealous patriots trading arms for hostages and funding Contra rebels. Investigations focused on Oliver North and a handful of operatives. The Bush role remained deliberately ambiguous. But the structure of the operation mirrors earlier patterns. Offshore accounts, deniable intermediaries, intelligence cutouts, and private networked funding all echo the same techniques that had built the first Bush fortunes in banking and oil. The logic was identical. Use crises to move money and power through channels unseen by the public. Bush's deniability depended on compartmentalization. Those who needed to know were skull and bones types of their own worlds. Military fraternities, intelligence circles, private clubs. The old formula of secrecy, loyalty, and insider advancement reappeared on a global scale. When Bush finally became president in 1989, it marked more than a personal triumph. It signaled the arrival of the intelligence class as open rulers. For the first time, a former Central Intelligence Agency director formally occupied the Oval Office. The hidden hand had stepped into the light, wrapped in patriotic rhetoric. His presidency framed the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the First Gulf War. Each event is usually narrated as history driven by public ideology and national interest. Follow the money and the alliances, and a different pattern emerges. During the run-up to the Gulf War, the Bush administration presented Saddam Hussein as a rogue aggressor who had miscalculated. The world was told that American troops fought for freedom and stability. Meanwhile, defense contractors, energy companies, and financial institutions aligned with the same Eastern establishment families secured massive contracts and long-term leverage over Middle Eastern oil flows. The war's timing, its media packaging, and the rapid deployment all reveal a deep familiarity with psychological operations. Footage of smart bombs,
Carefully curated briefings and strict message control turned a complex intervention into what commentators called a video game war. Behind the spectacle, the networks that had nurtured the Bush dynasty solidified their reach into the Persian Gulf. George H.W. Bush's single term ended, but the dynasty did not. His son, George Walker Bush, carried the name, the capital, and the networks forward. The next generation would fuse evangelical imagery, Texas swagger, and the same old Eastern networks into a new form of power. George W. Bush's early life is often portrayed as that of a directionless heir. Years of drifting, drinking, failed oil ventures, then a religious awakening, sobriety, and political focus. That is the redemption arc the public was sold. Parallel to that narrative runs a shadow track. George W. entered Yale in 1964. Like his father and grandfather, he joined Skull and Bones. Ritual continuity anchored the bloodline. The coffin confessions, the new name, the midnight oaths, the same walls, the same skulls, possibly even the same stolen bones of Geronimo that Prescott's generation had reputedly secured. At Yale, he was known more for fraternity antics than academic brilliance. But the society's math is not about grades. It is about lineage, loyalty, and future utility. A Bush in Bones was an investment in continued access to the highest office. After graduation, he tried his hand in energy companies like Arbusto and Spectrum 7. These enterprises underperformed by normal standards. Yet capital kept arriving.
Investment from figures like James Bath, reportedly linked to Saudi interests, kept the ventures afloat. The pattern echoed Prescott's and George H.W.'s earlier leverage of crisis and connection. On paper, the companies failed. In reality, they served as hubs for relationships and transactions. The key shift came when George W. became governor of Texas. State-level power gave him leverage over energy policy, regulation, and execution policies that appealed to tough-on-crime voters. It also placed him in daily contact with donors, lobbyists, and National Party strategists. By the time the 1999 presidential race took shape, the Bush name represented more than a family. It signaled a network that could deliver fundraising, media connections, and deep state reassurance. The same Eastern establishment that had backed George H.W. now had a chance to restore a trusted brand. The 2000 election turned into a constitutional drama. Hanging chads, lawsuits, a Supreme Court intervention. The official narrative is a clash of legal interpretations. The deeper reality is that in a moment of systemic ambiguity, the system defaulted to its own long-standing wiring. The son of a former Central Intelligence Agency director and president, a three-generation Skull and Bones initiate was placed in the Oval Office. Then came September 11. The attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon shattered the American psyche. In the immediate aftermath, many citizens rallied around the flag. Few noticed how quickly pre-written documents, war plans, and surveillance bills moved from drawers to the legislative floor. Within weeks, the Patriot Act expanded domestic surveillance. The Department of Homeland Security formed. 2 wars followed. Defense budgets exploded. Private contractors, many with intimate ties to intelligence communities, profited on a scale that dwarfed earlier conflicts. Under the surface, the same structural DNA reemerged.
A family tied to oil and banking dynasties presided over a war in oil-rich regions. Intelligence networks gained unprecedented domestic reach. Corporate allies harvested reconstruction contracts in Iraq and Afghanistan. The Skull and Bones pattern of crisis, leveraged for consolidation, replayed at planetary scale. George W. Bush's public persona emphasized faith, freedom, and a simple worldview. Behind closed doors, strategy meetings included figures connected to think tanks, energy firms, and old Wall Street houses, rooted in the same Eastern establishment chronicled by Carol Quigley. The rhetoric was new.
The architecture was familiar. Looking back across 3 generations, a coherent pattern comes into focus. Prescott Bush rode wartime production and suspect international banking to wealth, bound by skull and bones rituals and Eastern Club loyalty. George H.W.
Bush transformed oil ventures and Central Intelligence Agency stewardship into a role as overseer of global realignments, from China relations to the Persian Gulf. George W. Bush inherited the name and the network, presiding over the most expansive security state growth in modern American history after an event that justified nearly unlimited executive power. On the surface, these are stories about elections, policy debates, and historical contingencies. Underneath, they are case studies in how a bloodline aligned with a secret society can leverage crisis, capital, and occult-style symbolism to shape the direction of a nation. The occult component here is subtle, not cinematic. There are no televised black masses. Instead, ritual appears as patterned behavior. The repeated initiations in a windowless tomb, the annual gatherings at secluded camps and groves, the coded language of brotherhood and rebirth. Skull and Bones itself functions like an esoteric school of power. It teaches its initiates that they are dead to the old self and reborn into an elect. It embeds the idea that loyalty to the order supersedes ordinary obligations. It encodes the principle that real decisions happen in private, not under the fluorescent lights of congressional hearings. This is ritual magic transposed onto governance. Change consciousness, bind will, and direct energy through carefully maintained symbols, spaces, and oaths. The concrete outcomes appear as appointments, contracts, and laws. The underlying engine is initiatory. Even the family's public religiosity fits this structure. Prescott's Episcopal establishment piety, George H.W.'s restrained New England God talk, George W.'s evangelical inflection. Different expressions, same function. Religion provides a public cover for deeper commitments to the networks that actually allocate power. Occult symbolism appears not in obvious satanic imagery, but in repeated motifs.
The owl of Minerva watching at dusk, wisdom for the few. The use of skulls and bones in private rituals, while publicly championing life, liberty, and family values, the Hermetic principle is consistent. As above, so below. As in the tomb, so in the State Department. As in the Deer Island retreat, so in the Energy Task Force. What does this reveal about the nature of extreme wealth and power in America? First, that the official myth of the lone self-made man is insufficient. The Bush story is not about a random Texan stumbling into greatness. It is about a lineage that accessed pre-existing latticework of influence built by older banking and industrial families. Secret societies functioned as the joining mechanism. Second, that crisis is not merely an obstacle, it is raw material. World wars, financial collapses, oil shocks, terrorist attacks. Each event provided an opportunity to move assets, redraw maps, and expand surveillance. Those already wired into the system turned disaster into leverage, again and again. Third, that secrecy is not accidental. It is structural. Skull and Bones oaths, Central Intelligence Agency classifications, executive privilege, and private foundation confidentiality all serve the same function. They control who sees the map. Most citizens operate on stories, symbols, and televised narratives. The inner circle operates on documents, membership lists, and closed-door briefings. Fourth, that occult and esoteric practices are not fringe eccentricities, but embedded tools. The rituals at Yale do not float in isolation. They train a certain kind of mind, comfortable with double lives, hidden meanings, and layered realities. That mindset translates seamlessly into intelligence work, international negotiations,
and high finance. For the average American watching from the outside, the result is a sense that the game is rigged, but not knowing how. Jobs disappear, wars appear, policies shift.
The faces on screens change. The underlying direction does not. The Bush dynasty offers a rare, traceable thread through that labyrinth. 3 generations, each at nodal points where visible and invisible power intersect. From Union Banking Corporation to Zapata Offshore. From Central Intelligence Agency headquarters to the Oval Office after September 11. From secret society tomb to global war rooms. Is there a secret formula to this kind of success? The evidence suggests a few core components. A bloodline tied into old capital. Initiation into a network that spans universities, banks, media outlets, and intelligence services. A willingness to operate in the gray zones of law and morality, always with plausible deniability. A worldview that sees crises not as tragedies, but as opportunities. That formula is not written in any public how-to book. It is transmitted in tombs, retreats, and boardrooms.
It is enforced by loyalty, reinforced by shared secrets, and protected by layers of classification. Does this mean that everything is predetermined and that free will is an illusion? Not entirely. Elections still matter at the margins. Public opinion can slow or redirect certain initiatives. Whistleblowers can expose specific abuses. But the deeper architecture of who gets to stand on the main stage, whose family names repeat across decades, and which networks remain funded rarely comes up for a popular vote. The Bush dynasty is not the only example. It is one of the clearest American illustrations of how a secret society initiation, combined with banking and intelligence ties, can generate multi-generational power. It shows how public narratives about service and sacrifice can mask private strategies of consolidation. Now step back and connect the final dots. Prescott Bush, the banker whose firm's assets were seized under wartime laws, becomes senator and Skull and Bones elder.
George H.W. Bush, the oil man whose rigs sit near covert operations, becomes Central Intelligence Agency Director, Vice President, and President. George W. Bush, the underachieving son turned born-again leader, presides over the most sweeping expansion of surveillance and military reach in modern memory. 3 men, 1 bloodline, 1 secret society thread, woven through Yale, Wall Street, Langley, and Washington. Most people will continue to see these as disconnected biographies. They will accept the textbook story of elections, party platforms, and individual charisma. They will not ask why the same surnames keep reappearing at the apex of power, or why those surnames trace back to the same handful of universities and secret societies. You are not most people. You have seen how the money moves, how the rituals bind, how the crises align. You have seen how an elite brotherhood can incubate, protect, and elevate a family into a position where they can sign orders that send armies across oceans and laws that open your private life to digital inspection. The Bush dynasty is not the whole story. It is one room in a much larger architecture. Because if a single family could ride Skull and Bones, oil wealth, and Central Intelligence Agency power into 3 generations of influence, the obvious question becomes, who else is using the same blueprint, with more capital, more secrecy, and even deeper roots? To answer that, you have to leave the ranches of Texas and the tomb at Yale and follow the trail into other bloodlines. Families whose names rarely appear on ballots, but always appear in banking archives, foundation boards, and interlocking directorships.
Now that you have seen how one American dynasty turned secret society initiation and covert networks into real-world power, the next step is inevitable.
You have to ask who pulls their strings. And that question leads straight into the older European banking clans, the foundations that underwrite international institutions, and the discreet families whose crests hang in private lodges while their symbols appear, in stylized form, on the currencies and corporate logos you see every single day.